I could have two lipid panels that look the exact same, but one is of a 60-year-old male who has worked out for 10 years and is drinking alcohol daily. And that same lipid panel could be for some 26-year-old who works out, eats a lot of animal protein, and is super feeling great, So even though those numbers might be the same, the context is completely different. And so cholesterol isn't always painting a full picture for cardiovascular risk, which is why people are typically scared of that high cholesterol. And so the blatant facts are that cholesterol makes all of our sex hormones. And so many people are worried about hormone imbalances, having enough hormones, especially people coming off of birth control now, which we're seeing a big wave in. And so you need adequate cholesterol to have adequate hormone balance.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Wellness for Life. I'm your host, Niki Wolf, and I want to ask you today, have you ever wondered what your blood work could reveal about your health, or if you ever have felt frustrated when standard tests didn't give you the answers you needed? Today's episode is all about unlocking those secrets hidden in your blood work and how it could hold the key to preventing disease and optimizing your health. Our guest today, Hannah, will also share her recent health emergency that landed her in the hospital, what it taught her about her wellness, and how it's shaping her approach to helping others. So whether you're just starting your wellness journey or looking for deeper insights, this is going to be an episode you don't want to miss. So our guest today is Hannah. She's an integrative health coach, functional practitioner, and acne specialist. Through her experience in functional lab testing and strategic coaching, she helps people find the root cause of their symptoms and take charge of their wellness journey. Today, she will share not only her professional insights of her own personal health challenges, including her experience with an ovarian cyst and a recent health emergency. Welcome to the show, Hannah. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk all things blood work, functional testing, and I'm excited to educate your audience.
Absolutely. This is, I always say it's such an important conversation. I feel like every conversation we bring to the table is valuable, but I just know from today we're going to explore conventional medicine and, preventative functional approaches. And it's so important to understand blood work and understand the basics of this, not only so you know the questions to ask or the tests to, advocate for, but you feel empowered and you can better your health. You can work in prevention. But before we dive into all of that, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background and what inspired you to focus on functional lab testing and preventative health.
Absolutely. I'd like to say that I was kind of born with this passion for health because it truly is something that started emerging in middle school. I remember being 12 or 13 years old, just diving into the resources I could get my hands on at that time. So even things like healthy recipes on Pinterest or magazine articles, I was so intrigued and interested. And that really just carried with me and grew throughout high school and college. So I was constantly working on just learning about nutrition within high school, but it never really occurred to me that I could make it a career path because back then, kind of like, 8 years ago, it wasn't something that you really heard of, a practitioner or health coach. You heard of a dietitian, but that was really it. So I did not go to college for anything regarding health. I went for marketing and fashion merchandising. But I was immersing myself in health all throughout college. I had an internship with a wellness studio in my college town. I was working on wellness retreats. So it really did kind of become ingrained in me. And then my senior year of college, I started really becoming familiar with this idea of functional medicine. My younger sister is a type 1 diabetic. And so I think that kind of started to just provoke some thoughts of like, okay, what's happening in her body that's different than mine? And how does blood sugar work? And why is this impacting her mood and things of that nature? And so that did start to kind of get my wheels turning. And then on top of that, there was a lot of thyroid issues in my family that kind of were in my grandmother, my aunt, my mom. And so I started looking into that. I'm like, well, I want to check on my thyroid. And so that kind of started my journey looking into different functional practitioners and functional doctors. And I truly believe that everybody has the purest of intentions when they're trying to help somebody with their health. But I didn't have the best experiences with them because I think something that we are opening our eyes to now is that even in the functional space, there can be band-aids and really not getting to the root cause. And so, for example, I had a GI map done and it was positive with candida. The only advice I was given, it was to eat softer foods that were easier to digest, like mac and cheese. quote unquote. And I was like,
and this is from a functional doctor or
functional doctor, at least she claimed to be. Yes. Yep.
Okay.
And I'm like, this just doesn't feel intuitively right. And so I then went on to work with one more practitioner and give it a shot. And she went through my blood work with me and she's like, oh yeah, well, you're really inflamed. Like, okay, that's great, but why? And she's like, well, that can just happen, And I closed my laptop that day, sitting in my apartment. And I was like, I'm going to do this myself because I'm not getting the answers that I want. And this doesn't feel right to me. And then, so that was about 6 months out of college. And from there, I was like, I'm going to go to school. I'm going to do all the things. And that started like a 2-year journey of schooling.
How cool. Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff happens from our own personal experience. So your sister, type 1, thyroid issues in the family, but even, middle school, that's a very early age to like be provoked. Was there other things going on within your family, or did your mom, was she a supplement taker? Like, where do you think this inspiration came from?
Not at all. We had the very classic family. I was like a chicken finger child growing up. I was not healthy at all, but I was super active. I was doing sports, dance class, the whole nine. And so I wanted to know, one, just what did it mean to properly nourish my body? What does that look like? How do I work out best for my body? And a lot of my town was super athletic. And so I think part of it too was just wanting to look a certain way when you're starting to get into that age of 13, 14 years old. You wanted to be thin. It was the unhealthy patterns that kind of come into that. So I think all of that created a little bit of a perfect storm.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. And I feel like maybe when I look back to, you become more conscious. Especially middle school with girls, of your body, and to be able to stay in that healthy range and not go too far in one direction. Or maybe we do, but then we kind of pivot back. But yeah, I appreciate you sharing your story. I'd love to first, explore. Let's understand blood work and functional testing and really kind of these key differences between conventional, because I know, and this functional preventative blood work and why it matters. I know we're kind of throwing around that terminology, and I've used that within my show, but I'd love for you to share with the listeners, what do you mean by conventional versus functional?
Absolutely. I love using blood work and educating on blood work too, because while there's so many functional lab tests, blood work is typically something that everybody has access to. If you go to your annual appointment with your PCP, you're typically getting some sort of blood work, even if it's a super small panel. So to kind of put it into a couple of bullet points here, we think of conventional blood work versus functional blood work. The biggest difference in my eyes is going to be the ranges. So when you get your blood work done by your doctor and you get that back, you most likely see a set of ranges on the right-hand side. Those ranges are much wider than I would like them to be. And that's because they're based off of a analysis done of the whole population. And so therefore it makes it really easy to fall into those ranges, because unfortunately the whole population isn't taking care of themselves in the way that we want them to be. That population includes people who are sick, who are dealing with acne and skin issues, bloating, constipation. So when I'm looking at your health, I don't want to be comparing you to that range. I want to be comparing you to the people who are feeling optimal, who are, preventing disease, increasing longevity, have energy, clear skin. So we're using a completely different subset of ranges is the kind of the first and foremost thing. When I have looked at over 1,000 blood work panels this year, and it's not uncommon for somebody with a list of symptoms to come back with no markers out of medical range, meaning the lab didn't mark any of them out of their ranges. So that's kind of the first thing. And I would say the second thing is looking for patterns. It's not always about, is this marker in or out of range, but what kind of patterns are we seeing throughout your blood work, and how is that integrated with your symptoms? For example, if somebody is coming to me and they're experiencing a ton of eczema, am I seeing patterns for heavy metals in the lab? Is that messing with cholesterol metabolism? Is that creating deficiencies in the body? What am I kind of seeing there? Because ultimately you can look at single markers all day long, but you have to paint the picture as to what's going wrong with their health and then causing their symptoms to really identify the roadmap into how to fix it.
Absolutely. I think the key that you mentioned right away is, normal versus optimal. And I think that's something that we hopefully are starting to shift into. And I remember hearing that just because it's common doesn't necessarily mean it's normal or even good. And it's, I hear people, well, all of my friends have high cholesterol. They're on statins or XYZ. And I'm like, just because that's common doesn't mean that that's normal. Doesn't mean that that's what we want to relate ourselves with. And so I love that. And I think that's the beauty of functional medicine, is that you do get these optimal ranges. I mean, I'm kind of like a product of been in the hospital since I was 3, had to use Western medicine for a lot of stuff, but then I also have my functional doctors, and the difference that you see in those testing, and not even just with the ranges, also what they're testing. I mean, you talk about thyroid, you're probably a master of thyroid understanding, but conventional medicine really, I mean, what, just checks for TSH, maybe T4?
Yep, maybe T4, but it's usually TSH. And people bring that to me like, hey, can you tell me if my thyroid's optimal? And I'm like, no, I can't, because I'm only seeing a small little blip of its function.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's like, we need to look at the rest of the story to be able to figure out what's going on. And gosh, I mean, hopefully things start to shift around where we start to, I mean, I think functional medicine is now becoming more of a popular thing. People are seeking it out because we're starting to really see the difference. And so I love that. Now, why is it important for somebody to understand basic blood work? And really, what would you say basic blood work is? Like, where do we even start with that?
Yeah. So I would say, as like a small basic blood work panel, a CBC, which is a complete blood count. So it'll have things like your white blood cells, your red blood cells. That can tell us a lot about your immune system and underlying infection. So for example, white blood cells, like your body's immune soldiers. If those are out of optimal range, that gives us a clue right ahead, like, okay, something's burdening the immune system. So I love a CBC in addition to a CMP, a comprehensive metabolic panel. That will tell you your fasting glucose, liver enzymes, the function of your kidneys. So right there, just with those two, the CBC and the CMP, if you look at them from a functional optimal perspective, you can get a lot of information. And then on top of that, I love a lipid panel. It can tell us a lot about toxin status in the body, how your liver is doing, underlying infection. So I would say if you can remember those 3 big panels, a CBC, a CMP, a lipid panel, you can get a lot from that. And those are typically easier to get from your PCP, and or they'll already be running that in the first place. One thing I do want to mention is that you can do a CBC that does not have the white blood cell differentials. And the differentials can be really important. So you want to look for a CBC with differentials. So that would be like the most basic. Now, am I ever running that small of a panel in clients? No, I'm running some other kind of complementary markers on that. But if you can understand those, because that's what they ran from me at the hospital, you can still understand a lot.
Now, what do you mean by differentials for our listeners?
Yes. So when you think of your white blood cells and think of them, like I said, as your immune soldiers, you have the differentials, which are different types of white blood cells, aka different types of immune soldiers. So they'll all kind of fight that same mission if something kind of comes into the body that's not supposed to be there. Think about bacteria, fungus, heavy metals, mold, and mycotoxins, but they can elevate in response to certain things that they specialize in. For example, eosinophils are a type of white blood cell, and they will elevate in response to parasites. And so if somebody has an overgrowth of parasites, we'll typically see that eosinophil marker come up. So it can kind of give you more clues as to what underlying infection your body may be dealing with that's therefore burdening the immune system.
Brilliant. That makes so much sense. And would you classify like your natural killer cells, your B cells, T cells kind of within this category?
Correct. Yep. They don't show in the blood work panel, but yeah, they're all kind of living within those white blood cells.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. We didn't plan this ahead, but I'm just curious to hear your point of view on, I'm hearing, a variety of experts come on and talk about lipids and cholesterol. And, I've done an episode in the past, like the cholesterol controversy, like things are really starting to get flipped. And, even this conversation on like fats are good for you and fats make cholesterol. I mean, it's such a big topic, but I just love to hear your point of view on, is cholesterol bad for us? What is cholesterol? I know this wasn't on the agenda, but I'd love to like just squeeze this in there. And like when we're looking at our lipid panels, should we be so afraid? Because I have loved ones who, I have high cholesterol and I have this, but I don't want to get on a statin. And some of the books and research that you see is like, no, cholesterol is good for our body. So I'm just curious kind of where you stand on that topic.
100%. I love that question. The first thing I always say in regards to the cholesterol and lipid conversation is that context matters. I could have 2 lipid panels that look the exact same, but one is of a 60-year-old male who hasn't worked out for 10 years and is drinking alcohol daily. And that same lipid panel could be for some 26-year-old who works out, eats a lot of animal protein, and is super feeling great, So even though those numbers might be the same, the context is completely different. And so cholesterol isn't always painting a full picture for cardiovascular risk, which is why people are typically scared of that high cholesterol. And so the blatant facts are that cholesterol makes all of our sex hormones. And so many people are worried about hormone imbalances, having enough hormones, especially people coming off of birth control now, which we're seeing a big wave in. And so you need adequate cholesterol to have adequate hormone balance. It's also super important for our brain health, super important for the health of our cell membranes. So it is not something to be scared of. However, the ranges that we see on that blood work, the conventional ranges, kind of going back to that conversation, I would argue they're smaller than I look at. The range for LDL, for example, is like 0 to 99. So first of all, that's giving no consideration to LDL being low, and heavy metals and molds can really interfere with the metabolism of LDL and cause that to dip super low. But I would say LDL above 99 isn't always a risk factor. I can see it in super healthy individuals at 125, and that's great. And the only advice given to
sorry, cutting you off. Aren't there two different types of LDL? Because I think for such a long time, it was HDL. Like I remember, like I would hear analogies like HDL is happier, the heavenly, and LDL is like Lucifer, where it's like, no, we got to dig a little bit deeper that there's, I believe, and I'm not an expert at this, but like the smaller particles and then the soft, fluffy, like there's all these different ones that we need to dissect.
Yep. They've been coined as good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And unfortunately and fortunately, it's not that simple. It's all how they're being transferred in the body. And there's so many different factors that go into it. And so what I say to clients is if we are really worried about cardiovascular risk, maybe there's a family history or something of that nature, totally fine. Let's look at your lipid panel. Let's also look at the particle size, calcium tests, things like that, so that we can actually properly assess your cardiovascular risk, because most people aren't even looking at inflammatory markers that can really make that cholesterol dangerous in the first place to assess cardiovascular risk. So context matters. Cholesterol is definitely needed. I agree with that. And if it is high, I don't agree with the solution always being a statin. You know, the liver breaks down cholesterol. So if your liver is burdened, which most people are, we're going to see some elevated cholesterol. A lot of your LDL receptor sites are on your liver. So people have LDL come back high or something like that. And the only advice they're given is to stop eating red meat and eggs and things of that nature. And that's not what's going to, do it for you.
Absolutely. Now, what if you have a scenario, you put out two different individuals. What if you have somebody who's 60 years old, super healthy, eats great, moves their body, all this kind of stuff, but has high cholesterol? What are some of those markers that you are seeking out and you want to look through, kind of to your point of the context? Okay, well, let me make sure the inflammation's good. Let me make sure everything else is good. So yeah, you have high cholesterol, but everything else looks good and it doesn't really concern me.
Yeah. So I love to look at CRP, C-reactive protein. It's a protein produced by the liver in response to inflammation, which is also correlated with cardiovascular disease, but also that inflammation in general is correlated with multiple other diseases, Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer. So I want to look at that inflammation status. And in a lot of people, it can be high. And in most people, they're not having it checked by their conventional doctors to no fault of their own. It's just not being run. So I always like to look at CRP. I test it in every single client. And then insulin as well. Obviously, that is kind of, a factor with blood sugars regulation, but that can also play a role in elevated cholesterol. And then, of course, liver enzymes. Liver enzymes are really great to look at if your liver can't break down the cholesterol. And believe it or not, the thyroid's also super correlated to lipid panel. So if somebody has really wonky thyroid patterns, which again, most likely isn't a root cause, there's something impacting the thyroid, but that impact on the thyroid can then impact cholesterol. So really looking at that panel in totality of, is there underlying infection and inflammation? How is insulin and our metabolic health doing? How is the thyroid doing? And if it's not doing great, what is downstream affecting that? So it's looking at the body as a whole.
Fantastic. And when you say insulin, I just want to clarify, are you looking at fasting insulin? Are you looking at A1C? Like, what is the most important for you?
I look at all of them, but I would say that fasting insulin is the most important. Usually doctors are testing fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C via blood work. And you can also test your fasting glucose at home with a glucometer. So I love that tip. But I've yet to see any conventional doctor run fasting insulin yet. And it is so incredibly correlated to every single major disease. Dr. Peter Attia, who was a cancer surgeon, talks a lot about looking at fasting insulin levels. And I think every person should have it tested at least once a year, in my opinion, because I'm seeing them come back high even in very young people. And it's scary nowadays because we know that can only progress with time if they're not checked and worked on. So I'm testing fasting insulin in every client, and I love for it to be around 2 to 6.
That's fantastic. I love that there's been this shift of understanding glucose in such a deeper way, with the normalization of CGMs. I'm currently pregnant with my second, and I have to do an episode on this, but I refuse to do the glucose drink. And so for my first pregnancy, I provided my A1C. I did a CGM for 2 weeks, and I was like, hey, this is it. And they were like totally happy with that. And so I just had an appointment this morning, and I'm like, okay, I'll do my CGM again. And it's like, it gives you so much valuable information. And one right off the bat is just to empower people that you don't have to say yes to everything just because your doctor tells you it. To really be a critical thinker, I think is so, so important. And it depends on your priorities and your values and everything. But for me, those things just didn't align. But kind of back to this conversation, I think understanding glucose is so monumental. I had a history of severe hypoglycemia. I would go into the 40s, like throughout the night. And before I really, really understood blood sugar and how to regulate it, I would go to honey. Obviously, you're in the 40s. Most people are in a coma at that point. And so it took a while to get back to the foundations. But now having my daughter, she's 20 months and having my second one, I'm so conscious, not like hyper, okay, they have to eat this, but okay, if we're going to have toast, we're going to make sure there's a good amount of butter on there, really modulating this, because you look at, sorry, this is totally sidetracking, but I think it's all so important, is you look at your kids, if they're having regular tantrums, obviously there could be so many different variables, but are they just getting constant spikes of blood sugar? And that's completely dysregulating their nervous system, and everything goes out of whack. So it's not just weight. It's not just cholesterol information. It's not just, health. It's everything. I think blood sugar is just such an important thing, and it's so accessible nowadays to be able to understand and even be able to track your own.
100%. My dream would be to have this taught in schools. And, if we could teach like middle schoolers and high schoolers the importance of glucose and how they can even track it themselves, it would be monumental. And to your point, you're so correct. We're, feeding these kids school lunches that are spiking their glucose and then expecting them to sit in a chair to learn all day long. And then the teacher's saying they're having problems. They have ADHD or, need to go on medication for something. And it's like, hold on, we're not even looking at why this could be happening in the first place. So I completely agree and could talk about that for hours. So it was a sidetrack I'm happy to elaborate on.
Totally. Well, I think, there's not get too deep into political aspects, but I think there's a huge shift right now of, let's change the landscape of what we're not just giving the country, but what we're giving our children. So, we're in that direction. But what I'd love to hear more too is, the reason we connected in the first place is I was following you. You were sharing some stories of a recent trip to, I think it was the ER, a health kind of crisis that came about. And I love just hearing your perspective and your takeaways from it. But I want to dive deeper. I want to share that with the audience really from start to finish. Because it's been about a month since you've been in there. So I'm sure there's been a lot of new discoveries, but I just love to kind of open that up for you to share what happened and your takeaways.
Yeah, I am happy to share with this because, to be honest, I had no idea how common it was. And I shared this story that I'll talk about on my Instagram. My DMs were flooded with people like, oh, wait, this happened to me. This happened to me. And I'm like, who knew this was such a big thing for women to experience? So to take it back a little bit, I'm off birth control. I've been off birth control for over a year and a half or so now. So that has been fine. I had no issues coming off of it. And I really don't experience any, menstrual cramps or PMS symptoms. I'll get the occasional little cramps on my first day, but nothing out of the normal by any means. And of course, being that I work in health, I know all the things to calm down inflammation, what to do for the period if I'm a little bit out of whack. And so usually there's nothing that really disrupts my day. However, it was Monday morning. I had got my period that day and I started having cramps and I'm like, oh, okay, these are a little bit, more intense than normal. And so I kind of thought nothing of it. And then I just went to lay down with a heating pad for a little bit. I was about to go to a workout in 30 minutes. I had no intentions of knowing what this would be. In about 5 to 10 minutes, I would say it was the worst pain I'd ever experienced. It was the pain to the point where I was sweating, getting fever and chills. I was nauseous and going to throw up. I almost passed out because of it. And I had never experienced anything like that in my life. And so at that point, I was like, hold on, this might not be cramps. This could be something else. I didn't know if it was something much deeper. And so I finally got to the point probably about 15 minutes in where I was like, I need to go to the hospital because I truly don't know what this is. This is not cramps. I've never felt anything like this prior. So we drove to the hospital. I am like near passing out in the car the entire time. And so long story short, we were in there all day long, but ended up most likely being an ovarian cyst. They could probably kind of see some fluid post rupture, which is pretty common, but that's all they could really tell me. It was, I sat there for quite some time, and then it was like, yep, it was probably a small cyst that ruptured. And so then I'm like, okay, what do I need to do? Like, can I work out after this? Like, do you have any like lifestyle recommendations? Like, nope, you're good to go. And so I'm like, okay, but obviously being in my field, I'm like, this is really odd and there's something deeper here. And when I got home, I got the notification in my email that my blood work had came back from the hospital that they ran. Mind you, they didn't, share the blood work results with me in the hospital and say, hey, here's what's coming back weird. They just said like, it looks like an ovarian cyst from what we see. We'll want to check for X, Y, and Z. I even asked, like, do I need to get normal ultrasounds to make sure this isn't a problem? Like, nope, you're probably fine. And so I looked at the blood work and I'm like, oh my gosh, a cyst ruptured and there's infection in the body because I know what this looks like. I know what this is. And so just to give like a little bit of context, my white blood cells that I talked about previously, super, super high, higher than I had seen in any blood work panel I've looked at this year.
And what's ranges when we're talking about optimal, what is super high?
Yep. So mine were 13. The optimal range I like for white blood cells is 5.5 to 7.5. Typically I'm seeing them low because the immune system of people is really burdened nowadays, but they will go high in acute situations like an ovarian cyst rupture, even with like cold and flu, things like that. But 13 is pretty high. And then my neutrophils and my lymphocytes were also super out of whack. So to give more context there, I love neutrophils between 40 and 60%, looking at the percentage, not the absolutes, and lymphocytes between 24 and 42. My lymphocytes were, I believe, like 12 or 11, like in the floor. And then my neutrophils were super, super high at 80. And neutrophils would elevate in response to bacteria. And so as cysts rupture, they can release infection. And so, the power in blood work is I was able to look at that. And even though they did not go through it with me at the hospital or say anything that they were thinking based off of those markers, I knew from my experience of, okay, this is not right. And I can pretty confidently say that most of my clients and most of my clients within our ClearStem membership that we do would know at least enough to be like, this isn't right. Like, these are not the ranges that I typically look at. Something went wrong here. And so with that, I was able to be like, I need to look further into this. Like, one, there's infection lingering in my body now because I see this, really big fluctuation in these types of white blood cells. What is this from? So that was kind of the hospital visit. And I went on to go to the gynecologist because I wanted an ultrasound where they had said, same thing. I kind of saw some fluid, but there were no more cysts on the ovaries. And so I'm like, okay, great. But this came so out of the blue that I want to check and make sure this isn't going to happen periodically. Like, how do I kind of have some sort of routine in place? And she said, birth control, that's the only way you can mitigate them, And so I'm like, and at this point, I feel like people get really frustrated when hearing that. And I totally get it, but I was almost expecting that. I'm like, okay, gotcha.
So I feel like you like check out. You're like, okay, I've heard enough. Okay, thank you. Have a nice day. Yep. And you're like, okay, I'm never going back there again.
Yep. 100%. And so it's like, I knew that I was going to the gynecologist simply to get the ultrasound and, taking that and leaving it, and going forth with it. So I then went on to find an amazing functional clinic in, Charleston, which obviously I can run on my own labs, but as a practitioner, I think it's so nice sometimes to have a different set of eyes on the labs that you're looking at all day long. And one thing that I kind of forgot to mention throughout my trip to the hospital and the gynecologist is my urinalysis kept coming back really wonky. And they said, quote, you must be a medical mystery. Like, I don't know why this is weird if you don't have a UTI. And I'm like, it's off because there's infection that can impact the GI tract, the bladder, the urine, all the things. So I then went to this functional clinic and kind of told them everything I'm telling you. And I'm like, here's what I think it is. Like, there is infection. There's something causing this to linger. Do you agree that that could have been a big role in the cyst? And they're like, 100%, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so I just ran blood work this week that I'm going to be getting back. And I ran a test for mycotoxins and heavy metals. And so to give you kind of context as well, without going too into depth here, I had eczema basically out of the womb when I was super young. I struggled with eczema, super sick as a kid, strep throat all the time, lots of antibiotic usage, got pulled out of daycare because I just kept getting sick. And that all plays a role in our health now. And so I've gotten the eczema to go away, but I still kind of like have remnants of at least like the itching skin that can be a cause from metals. And when I had ran my last GI map, there was chronic candida still there. So I've been in the middle of kind of doing a ton of research on this. And metals are something that will keep candida and fungus around. I think it's important to say because we have a lot of people who are getting GI maps done, which is an amazing, amazing test to test the stool and the gut. And candida is coming back on it. You can take antifungals all day long, but if you don't really address those metals, it's going to keep coming back. And so I was like, I'm going to run this metal test. I'm going to run this mold test, and I'm going to predict that mercury is going to come back because mercury keeps candida around. Dr. Klinghardt is a great doctor. I love to follow his work. And he has made the claim that 98% of patients with candida have mercury toxicity. So I get the test back. Lo and behold, super high in mercury. And then I have mycotoxins in my body, but it's the type of mycotoxins that are produced by candida and fungus. And so I'm like, this I think is what caused the cysts and kind of really contributes to that infection and the wonky patterns in the urinalysis. Even though I've been working on them and doing a lot of things for them, I think that they are kind of my deeper root cause of what I need to continue healing that have probably been in my body since I was super, super young. So that's kind of a long-winded story of my experience, but hopefully that is helpful to others.
No, it's great. I have a few questions that we'll kind of like dissect. First off, before I forget, can you explain to our listeners mycotoxins? And I'd be curious to hear for your urine analysis, what were some of, as we're discussing blood work, like what are some of those things that like we might want to be looking out for?
Yeah. So the urinalysis is actually one of those things that might be easier to interpret on your own because there are things within the urinalysis like your leukocytes, your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and they'll blatantly say high, like they'll be bolded on that blood work. So you'll know something is wrong. Like my urinalysis was kind of lit up like a Christmas tree. So it wasn't hard to see to the naked eye of like, okay, something's wrong here. And then your pH levels. So I don't know the exact range that they put on the blood work for the pH levels, but we like somewhere between like 6.5 and 7.5. Anything off of that can be indicative of either dehydration, mold, and metals. And I see this all the time in clients because as we're detoxing different types of toxins that are releasing metals, they'll get a UTI because it's impacting their urinary tract. So urinalysis is a good thing to kind of check in on. And you can also even see like via cloudy urine, that can be a great way to check. And then mycotoxins, that is going to be what's produced by different mold species and fungal species. So a lot of people can be dealing with that, whether you are living in an environment with mold or whether you have an overgrowth of fungus in your gut. There can be a lot of things that can lead to mold in the body.
Great. And I know mold, I found out a few years ago I had Lyme and, so mold conversation always comes up with that. And I think even I feel like it was like Dave Asprey that I started hearing like mold a lot more. For somebody listening, what should kind of spark their interest of like, okay, let me go get some mold testing or, is that something I need to do? Is there any sort of question that they should be asking themselves that would really like provoke them for getting tested?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, if you can think of a time in your life where you lived somewhere or somewhere frequently where there were obvious signs of mold. So some of my clients, they don't think of it in that time when they were living in it, but they'll look back and be like, wait, I was living in an apartment. We had a big leak, or I was in a work environment. Every time I went to work, I got a massive headache and was feeling congested. So there's a couple of different things there. I would say just like really look back over the history of your lifetime. Like where have you lived? Where have you spent a lot of time? Is there any possibility that mold could be in those places? We see it a lot with college students because moldy dorms or apartment buildings that aren't, kept up with well, that can cause a lot of molds. I would say that. And then the tricky thing is with mold, it can present in a ton of different symptoms. It can really be the kitchen sink. I would say most commonly, we can see a lot of brain fog, a lot of congestion in the sinus cavity because mold spores can colonize in the sinus cavity. You can see GI issues being caused, a lot of skin issues. I would say most commonly rashes. You can for sure see acne and things like that, but eczema, psoriasis, like rashes are things that I see a lot from mold. And then if you're not feeling right in terms of like fatigue or energy or sleep, it's something to look into. I heard a stat, and I haven't fact checked this, but that half of the buildings in the country had mold in them, which is insane. And so I think it's also about knowing that we're inevitably going to be exposed a little bit. So what can we be doing in our daily life to help combat that, which I'm sure we'll kind of get into.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I want to dive into that, but one other thing I want to kind of pull out. Have you, and my brain always like rattles this way. You said you were pretty much born almost kind of coming out with eczema. I'm curious, have you found any correlations between maybe the delivery, like were you C-section, were you vaginal, anything that your mom went through? I mean, obviously vaccines like later on, but have you made any sort of correlation of your health growing up and how your mom in like the pregnancy and everything went?
Yep. I had a very complicated birth and pregnancy. My mom had preeclampsia. We were rushed to the hospital, and then I was very early. I was premature, so they gave my mom steroids to make sure that my lungs were grown to make sure that I could be ready for birth. So it was extremely complicated. C-section, emergency C-section, antibiotics, like the whole everything that you could think of to throw on there. That was my birth, and so I think that's a good like just tidbit for the audience too. Is prior to getting into this space, I had not really a big clue as to like what went on in my birth story. I knew that it was a complicated birth, but I didn't know kind of the facts. And so ask your mom about, what happened, what went down. Was there anything that I should know about my birth? And then something else to consider is that I am the firstborn. I'm the oldest of 3 girls. And so the firstborn will receive the largest toxin load passed down from the mother. So if my mom had a lot of heavy metals, that's a big thing that are passed down from mom to baby. And so I love looking at metal tests for clients who are wanting to conceive because that can be a big thing that can be passed down. And so I have theories. I can only speak on this anecdotally, but again, with my sister having type 1 diabetes, there's some research to show how metals impact the pancreas. And so it's just been a theory that I've had for quite some time. And I'm going to test my mom and see her metal levels currently because I'm really interested now that all of this has happened. But yes, there's a lot of things at birth that could have all kind of correlated to that.
Absolutely. I think it's so important. And if you're listening, whether you're pregnant or you want to become pregnant, I mean, this is so important that it all starts so early. I mean, you think about like my mom and maybe her mother. I mean, I don't think my mom was, but like, it was so normal to be smoking cigarettes and eating whatever. And it's like, then you look at the issues that they developed later on in life. And so it's like, it's so important, not just for our own health, but even for generations to come. We have somewhat of an impact of the health of our children and grandchildren. And so, yeah, I think that's so important. Is there any sort of like standout underlying, like major health concern with the 3rd child? First of all, I never knew that. That's like brilliant that like the toxin overload kind of starts to go down a little bit as kids continue coming.
Yeah, unless the mom was exposed to something, in between pregnancies, like living in mold and things like that. But typically the firstborn will get the largest load there. So no acne and things of that nature. And so my poor family, I'm about to like just make everyone do heavy metal tests and do all this testing for my own research. We've all suffered with acne, which both my parents really suffered with a ton of acne, hence kind of the work I do now. And insulin issues, I would say. And so when I first tested my fasting insulin, it was a issue. And so blood sugar conversation obviously is pretty prevalent through myself and my siblings. So I've seen high fasting insulin in all of us, except for obviously my diabetic sister. So that's been a thing. And my grandmother, type 2 diabetes, very overweight, like textbook, ended up passing of cancer. If I had, known then what I know now. And so there's definitely some kind of genetics that are trickling down and predisposing us to some things there. But of course, genetics loads the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger.
Absolutely. And I know we'll kind of get into that a little bit, but like, yeah, genetics, absolutely. It's like, it's something to consider and be aware of and, have as an understanding, but it's not kind of the telltale of what our health can look like.
Yep.
I'd love to explore some of these kind of like, I mean, first of all, you've already provided so much information, but some tangible pieces of advice for improving our health and well-being, whether it's dedicated to, okay, how do I reduce my exposure to molds, or how do I reduce my inflammation? Kind of maybe your key pillars of health and what you find is important from diet, lifestyle. I mean, all those different ones.
Yep. So what I kind of go through first is the foundations, which I think this topic of covering the foundations and continuously supporting the foundations of your health is becoming more prevalent. But thinking of the true basics that we often overlook, what do we all need to survive? Clean air, clean water, and good food. That is like the basics of our foundation. And that seems pretty simple. Like, oh yeah, I've got that, check. However, most of us don't have clean air. if you're living in mold or you're in a city, things like that. So getting an air filter, I believe, is so helpful. We can, link some in the show notes if that's helpful, but getting an air filter for at least your bedroom where you're sleeping can be really helpful. Or if that's not an option, just work on opening your doors and windows. Like get some fresh air into your home. Clean water. So I have tons of people who are like, oh yeah, well, my fridge has a filter. Or, oh yes, I have a Brita, no worries. And unfortunately, that is not cutting it. We have tons of things that we want filtered out of our water, heavy metals being a big one. So getting a little bit of a higher quality water filter is crucial. I think everybody should have a good water filter. And again, we can link some brands there. So clean air, clean water, and then food. I think that as we progress and we kind of just dive deeper into like wellness as a culture, we're going to be wanting to get our food from an area that's closer to us. So we're going to want to know our farmer, know how the food's being grown. And obviously that feels a little bit intimidating. And it's like, yes, I still, shop at grocery stores, all of that. But if you can be familiar with the farm's processes or find a local farm, go to the farmer's market, you're going to be doing yourself such a favor, because not only are the nutrients going to be, higher in the fruits, the produce, the vegetables, but if you can get the meat that's fresh or the eggs that are fresh from the farm, you're going to mitigate kind of like the big food industry and all that kind of stuff. But even Force of Nature, for example, is a great meat brand in Whole Foods that you can find. And there's a lot of like subscription-based services where you can go on like a cow share and things like that. So getting familiar with where your food is coming from to the best of your ability, I would argue. And then something I always bring up, almost everybody drinks coffee. And mold is a big thing that can be in your coffee. So if you're going to drink your coffee every day, I'm all for it, but make sure that it is the highest quality coffee that you can find, organic, tested for mold and mycotoxins. And then when you kind of think of your cup of coffee, how can you make it work for you? So for my clients dealing with insulin resistance, we'll add inositol to their coffee. We can add raw honey to sweeten it instead of any type of sugar, making sure that we're getting the cleanest type of milk. If you're adding milk to it, that's good grass-fed dairy, or if you're not able to do dairy, a really good organic coconut milk with no fillers in it. So I think it's just like looking at those basics of what you're going to build your house on, like that foundation, and make it really sturdy before you kind of go into like the really fun things like the supplements, the lab testing, all that, which are great. And I do think they definitely serve a purpose in today's world, but those foundations are what's going to get you the furthest.
Perfect. I love that. I think also to your point of making the coffee work for you, something, especially if you do have reactions of like jittery or anxiety afterwards, looking into adaptogens, or I even think having your coffee after you eat a meal so you don't have as such strong of a reaction. So we'll make sure to link from the air filters to the water filters to the meat brands, even some coffee options as well. And I can't recall if you mentioned why coffee in particular, they're just known to have some of the highest levels of mycotoxins.
Yeah. So some can come from the actual like coffee pod makers. There are specific strains of even bacteria that can grow in the coffee pods. Why they like coffee, that I don't know. But thinking of just like how coffee is kind of manufactured, and think of like a Starbucks. It's being shipped in on trucks. Those trucks are probably hot. The coffee is dark and, close. It's just the perfect environment for something like mold to grow.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. I mean, you think about when you open those bags, it's like the beans look like moist and shiny, but I mean, like that's an environment that can, good point. Something that I've always been thinking of, and during pregnancy, I just don't really care for coffee, but I think about that hot coffee, I guess, depending on how you brew your coffee, if you're doing an espresso, whatever that looks like. But I think about the traditional standard coffee pots, you're pouring this boiling water over plastic.
100%.
And so I'm like, it's just starting to like rattle my brain. Obviously, you can get like a Breville where everything's like this metal, and that's probably a healthier version, or maybe even like a glass metal Chemex. What's your choice of how to brew your coffee?
From a cost-effective standpoint too, go for a stainless steel or a glass French press. It'll be super easy. You're mitigating all plastic. You don't have to buy, a big fancy Breville. If you want to, go for it. But a French press is so easy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great recommendation. I feel like I've gone through all different cycles of like how I do it. And I think one of the biggest things probably, and people can get away from are those, the Keurig plastic pods and just all the other things that are inside of those. I know that those brands do have like the reusable forms. And I have like an espresso maker, but I'm like, dang, that actually might be more of aluminum, which that could probably create some of his other issues.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
awesome.
100%. And it's like, I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed by it of like, well, how do I switch all this stuff? And like, I'm set up for failure. And I would just challenge them to take that information and be like, wow, I've got all these ways to contribute to my health, to empower myself. And I think what's scarier is not knowing how to prevent some of these things. We kind of have this mindset that cancer just happens, Alzheimer's just happens. And there could be probably some cases for that where cancer takes a toll and we can't understand why. But even the aluminum example you just get, aluminum is very correlated to dementia. And so instead of being like, oh, I got to get a new coffee maker now, I got to give up my pods or whatever, be like, wow, I have an easy way, something simple I can change in my daily life that could make monumental shifts in my health for the next 50 plus years.
I love that so much. It's a shift of perspective. I mean, we can utilize that through every aspect of our life. That I think that was a brilliant, brilliant way to look at it. And just taking baby steps. I had a guest on recently that like totally shifted my brain. And you might not agree with that. I don't know if a lot of people do, but she's like, honestly, I think supplements are the first step people should take. And you might totally disagree, but she says sometimes when we're so overwhelmed and there's so much on our plate, it's the easiest thing we can implement that can move the needle the quickest. And so if you are overwhelmed and like changing your diet and getting up early to exercise and do all this, you're still stuck in this brain fog and your body's not working properly. Everybody can take a capsule for the most part. And so that can kind of get you out of some of this fog so that you can start implementing the other things. I'm not saying it's a foundational, component. I do think, diet, lifestyle, supplementation, but I can very much see a place for it being the first thing to start, especially when you are just so in deep, whether there is cognitive decline, whether there is mold, just doing that so that you can kind of start seeing out of the clouds. I don't know. She shared that and I was like, okay, that totally makes sense to me.
I love that. No, and I think that's like a great example of too, where everyone's journey is so different. And I think from my perspective, a lot of people do come to me taking supplements. So I'm like, okay, what do we do from the lifestyle perspective, the water filter and so on? But I completely agree. And I think that the power of supplements nowadays is needed in our environment. And so if, for the busy mom who she's got very little time for herself, if she can take 2 capsules per day to really further her health, I'm all for it. Or if she can just add some inositol to her coffee, like great, you can do a lot of good even if you can't get to the other things yet. So yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely.
And like to not neglect, I mean, I could see those patients, well, I'm taking all this stuff, but what does your diet look like? What is it like? All of it encompasses, is all important. So, well, this was so brilliant. I loved all the deep dive into everything. I think there were so many takeaways, not just for myself, but I know listeners are going to appreciate it. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel like is so important to discuss? Maybe somebody who's just, wants to know a little bit more about blood work, wants to be more informed or even feel confident to talk to their doctors about, what they need to advocate for. What would your advice be for them?
Yeah, I would say that blood work is becoming more accessible. It still can be a little bit of a barrier, but there are websites where you can go get your blood work done and you can put in a basic CBC and CMP for like $30. Or there's like Function Health, Mark Hyman kind of has where it's a lot of blood work, but you can still get it done. So I would say like if your doctor really won't run some basic blood work for you, maybe find a new doctor, but there are other outlets where you can run it and take your health into your own hands. And that's kind of even going back to that hospital example. Like when I left the emergency room and they were like, nope, you're good to go. I wasn't like, okay, I'm truly good to go. It was like their work is done because there was no true emergency now. And now my work starts. And so I think we rely so much on the conventional medical system. And we have to remember that it's not their job necessarily to heal us, or at least they weren't taught that. And so their job is to treat us in an emergency. Most of these symptoms that we're hearing nowadays aren't, unfortunately and fortunately, emergencies. And so just because a doctor or somebody in the medical field doesn't tell you that you need to do X, Y, and Z for your health doesn't mean that they're necessarily not doing their job or that that's true. It just means now you have to take it into your hands, and it is a responsibility. Some people are like, well, I don't have time to cook or do this. It is a responsibility. It is not just a privilege that we are born with. We do not get to keep our health. And so if you can put some of your budget into, basic blood work and some supplements and really just take that, there are so many resources to become your own guru. And I really encourage you to do so.
Absolutely. I love that so much. Where can listeners find more information about you, whether it's social media, website, and kind of maybe share some of the work that you're doing as well?
Yeah. So everything is Hannah Brooke Wellness. It's Hannah Brooke Wellness on Instagram and then hannahbrookewellness.com. And I've linked to my Substack and my Instagram bio where you can subscribe to that. And I do biweekly newsletters to try and kind of teach on this concept of empowering you to understand basic blood work. And then the current work that I am doing. So my practice, I say this with a lot of gratitude, but it is full. So I'm not able to accept new clients at this time for like a one-on-one perspective, but I'm also doing work with ClearStem Skincare. We have a new telehealth sector where we're going to blood work on acne clients to help them get to the internal root cause of their acne. So I do that a lot. And then I also have a passion for helping aspiring health coaches and practitioners get into the field because I believe that the world needs more passionate, purpose-driven practitioners. So I am working on releasing a course to help practitioners start their business and do a lot of mentorship in that aspect. And I'm just always looking to learn. So I think there'll be a lot of cool things that I'm really excited about for 2025. And yeah, I'm always happy to support anybody in any way I can on their health journey.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise, your experience, everything that you went through, and kind of just handling the little side tangents and things that I've thrown at you. But this was incredibly valuable, and I know our listeners will love it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.